the murder that happened during Mass. Welcome to Warm Chapters. I'm your host, Thomas, and I'm truly happy to have you here. There's something deeply comforting about settling into a quiet mystery together, wherever you may be in the world. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read each and every one. Now pour yourself a warm cup of tea or coffee and let's get started. Chapter 1. Carols by Candlelight. The stone tower of St. Mary Mead Church rose black against a sky of hard cobalt blue as Christmas Eve gave way, inch by inch, to midnight. Beneath that ancient tower, the church seemed to breathe with an old and solemn life of its own. Wax tapers trembled in their sconces. The painted saints in the windows glowed and faded by turns, their ruby robes and emerald halos shivering in the uncertain candlelight. A stillness lay over the nave, deeper than the snow banked on the village green outside, broken only by the faint rustle of prayer books, the muted clearing of throats, and the soft collective breathing of a congregation waiting for holiness to descend. The smell of damp wool and fur collars mingled with frankincense. Near the porch, a draught teased at the latch, with a sound so slight it might have been mistaken for a whisper. Yet there are whispers that carry more warning than any shout, and Miss Jane Marple, moving with her customary mild precision down the north aisle, was not a woman to mistake one thing for another. Her dove-grey tweed brushed against cedar branches arranged around the font. She chose her seat carefully, as she always did, and settling into the shadowed pew near the west door, a position which afforded an admirable view of the congregation, and equally importantly invited very little conversation. From there she could see the entire church spread before her, each pew, each head inclined in piety or fatigue, each little domestic grouping arranged as neatly as pieces upon a board. Miss Marple had long held that human beings in church were, in certain respects, even more revealing than human beings at tea. Mrs. Bantry was present, of course, wearing a hat adorned with a feather so recent and so determined that it appeared almost militant. Colonel Easterbrook, muffler wound about his neck, polished his spectacles with habitual fussiness. The vicar's wife, efficient and immaculate, smoothed a lace collar that required no smoothing whatsoever. These were familiar notes in the village composition, but there was one discord. 3 pews ahead, in the place usually occupied by the butcher's broad and noisy family, sat a stranger. He was a large man, broad in the shoulder and sitting very still. His coat, though excellently tailored, belonged unmistakably to another decade. It remained buttoned despite the warmth within the church. Snowflakes, not yet melted, still silvered the dark collar. When the organ swelled into once in Royal David's city, he lifted his head with sudden alertness, like an animal catching a scent upon the wind. For one instant the firelight caught the long white seam of a scar running near his temple, then lost it again. Miss Marple noticed him precisely as she noticed everything else. Not dramatically, not with any flourish, but with that serene completeness of attention which in another person might have passed for absent-mindedness. She stored away the image of the scar, the outmoded coat, the unnecessary fastening of the buttons, as carefully as a librarian returns a rare volume to its proper shelf. The choir entered in procession, their surplices pale and ghostly under the candlelight, their young voices rising pure and clear into the rafters. It should have been beautiful. Indeed, to most people present, it probably was beautiful. Yet to Miss Marple there ran beneath the sweetness of the music a current as cold and hidden as black water under ice. The vicar's wife dropped a sheet of music and for the first time in anyone's memory failed to pick it up at once. Young Emily Price, usually so self-contained, missed a note and coloured violently. On the south side of the church, Mr. Arthur Trallion closed his eyes in what seemed at first glance to be reverence. Yet when they opened again there was in them not devotion, but a private and calculating concentration. Miss Marple let her gaze drift to the side chapel where the choir boys waited among holly and scarlet ribbons for their appointed moment. Most of them shifted, whispered, and exchanged furtive nudges with the careless cruelty of the young. But one boy, Thomas Finch, stood unnaturally rigid, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white. His lips moved once or twice, but not in prayer. His eyes kept darting toward the vestry door. Nervousness in a choir boy at midnight service was nothing extraordinary. Terror was another matter entirely. Miss Marple, who had seen fear in many guises, in girls who had lost their positions, in wives with overbright smiles, in men whose politeness came half a second too late, recognised it now. Fear first stiffens the body, she reflected, before it drives it into sudden movement. Thomas Finch stood not like a boy awaiting his cue, but like a creature listening for pursuit. Candles were passed from hand to hand, each tiny flame transferring itself to another in a gesture of perfect Christian fellowship. Wax hissed softly upon brass drip pans. The vicar ascended the pulpit and began to speak of light in darkness, of comfort in affliction, of hope descending into a weary world. His words were gentle enough, but his hands gripped the wood so hard that the knuckles showed raw and pale. There was the faintest tremor in his voice. Across the aisle, the stranger listened with absolute stillness. Mrs. Bantry raised her lorgnette in what she no doubt believed was a discreet fashion. It was not discreet. Miss Marple, who knew her friend's limitations, did not hold it against her. Outside, snow whispered against the leaded panes with the delicate persistence of fingers. Inside, the service moved toward its highest point, and with it some tension, unspoken, invisible, but increasingly definite, seemed to draw taut through the church. Miss Marple could almost have sworn that the candle flames leaned in one direction at once, like grasses pressed by a passing body. Then came that smallest of changes by which danger often announces itself. Mr. Trallion bent his head toward the person beside him and murmured something behind a gloved hand. Thomas Finch visibly blanched, as if an icy hand had closed over his spine. The stranger shifted in his seat, and in that shift the lining of his coat parted just enough for Miss Marple to glimpse a narrow pouch sewn inside. Communion began. The congregation rose pew by pew, moving forward in a slow current of dark coats, pale gloves, bowed heads, and flickering candles. Faces glowed and receded in the light, becoming strange and almost disembodied, like saints in an old procession. Miss Marple remained where she was, preferring as always to observe the pattern before touching the threads. Mr. Trallion approached the altar rail and knelt with an air of grave humility that was perhaps a trifle too studied. The stranger did not move. He remained in his pew, head lowered, lips still. Behind him, Thomas Finch hovered uncertainly until a senior chorister nudged him forward with impatience. The boy obeyed, took one faltering step, and then slipped sideways into the shadows near the lectern instead. When the final amen rolled upward and dissolved among the old beams, a quiet sigh moved through the church. The worst of the cold, the fatigue, the solemnity was over. People relaxed. Prayer books snapped shut. Scarves were found. There was that faint communal easing one always sees at the close of a successful church service. And yet the undercurrent remained. Near the font, Mrs. Bantry remarked in a low voice that the church had grown positively freezing. Dr. Haydock told her rather shortly that medieval buildings were notorious for draughts. Miss Marple, who knew both Dr. Haydock and medieval buildings, privately thought that neither was to the point. Coldness, like silence, often signals that something has just happened and is trying very hard not to be noticed. At length she stepped out beneath the porch. Midnight lay over the village in a hard glitter of frost. Every hedge, every roofline, every bare branch shone as though dusted with crushed diamonds. The choristers clustered together in little steaming knots, their breath silvering in the dark. But Thomas Finch was not among them. Nor, she observed after a moment, was the stranger. He had disappeared so completely that, had she been a less exact woman, she might have doubted he had ever been there at all. But on the snow beyond the lich gate a set of fresh footprints led away from the main path and angled toward the dark yew walk. The vicar, occupied with farewells, had not noticed. No one else seemed to have noticed either. Miss Marple paused, her head tilted slightly, listening to that curious silence which sometimes follows a single furtive movement. Somewhere in the distance a barn owl cried. Somewhere else a door banged with unnecessary force. Those sounds, too, were filed away. She turned at last toward her cottage, drawing her coat more tightly around her. Her thoughts were already arranging themselves with domestic neatness, the stranger's scar, Thomas Finch's terror, the vicar's trembling hands, Mr. Trallian's watchful glances, the hidden pouch, the vanished boy. One must not jump to conclusions, of course. One never should. But facts, when laid side by side, have a way of beginning to speak. Behind her, the church bell sounded midnight. 12 solemn notes drifting over the frozen lanes, over cottage roofs, over footprints that would soon harden into testimony. Miss Marple walked on, a small elderly lady moving quietly through the Christmas night. And yet, though none of the cheerful households behind lighted curtains could possibly know it, she was the one person in St. Mary Mead fully awake to the uneasiness beneath the carols. At the crossroads she stopped and turned to look back at the tower. The sky above it was clear now, and one star burned steadily over the frosted black outline of the church. The stranger's footprints, she noticed, had diverged still further from the common path, cutting toward the old yew walk that led eventually in the direction of the disused well. Curious, very curious indeed. Her boots gave little creaks in the hard snow as she resumed her way. In her reticule rested a pencil, a square of blotting paper, and the small notebook in which she occasionally set down observations too exact to trust to memory, though her memory was in truth excellent. No detail was too trifling. Trifles, she often thought, had sent more men to the gallows than grand passions ever did. At her gate she paused once more and looked up at that unwavering star. There are seasons, she reflected, in which wickedness seems almost vulgar and out of place. Christmas is one of them. And yet human nature does not become angelic merely because holly is hung in the windows and puddings are set to steam. Indeed, concealment often flourishes best beneath a surface of goodwill. Inside the cottage the hall lamp cast a soft amber glow over familiar furniture and polished wood, and Miss Marple removed her gloves and laid them side by side on the escritoire with the same care she might have given to physical evidence. Then she opened her notebook. Before the minute hand had completed another circuit, she had entered her observations in a series of neat, exact lines. The stranger, scar on temple, Thomas Finch, fear, not nerves, Vicar, hand shaking, Arthur Trallian, restless, watchful, communion, tension increased, both boy and stranger absent after service. She paused, pen in hand, listening. From beyond the frosted orchard came the distant bark of a dog, once only, abrupt and uncertain, as though some instinct had stirred and then fallen silent again. On the mantelpiece the clock ticked with homely assurance. Yet beneath its measured beat, Miss Marple fancied she could hear another rhythm altogether, the insistent pulse of folly, secrecy and danger moving through the village night. She dipped her pen once more. Christmas Eve, she thought, is generous with revelation. By daylight, St. Mary Mead might wake to find that the old familiar piece proclaimed under Candlelight had been purchased at a far greater cost than anyone yet understood. And with that, while the bells of St. Mary Mead seemed still to echo faintly in memory, she began, in her quiet and methodical way, the first true notes of the investigation. Chapter 2. Murder at the Altar. The organ gave a final sigh, the last chord floating upward into the rafters like breath on winter air. Reverend Lenwich lifted the silver chalice. The choir's final note thinned and vanished into the stone. Then came silence. Not ordinary silence, Miss Marple thought, but the strained and listening kind, the sort that seems to gather itself in expectation of a blow. The candles trembled. Frosted breath hung briefly visible. A lantern near the side aisle fluttered and recovered. Mr. Arthur Trallian stepped forward from his pew with all the composed dignity appropriate to a prosperous churchwarden and benefactor of the parish. His coat was immaculate. His white scarf, arranged with particular care, shone against the dark velvet of his waistcoat. He genuflected, lowered his head, and while the choir began a soft Kyrie, he moved toward the altar rail. For one suspended second the scene seemed arranged like a Christmas card. Devotion, candlelight, polished silver, sacred ritual. Then the impossible intruded. Mr. Trallian swayed. It was not dramatic at first. Merely a slight movement, as though his balance had deserted him. The chalice flashed in the light. His hand made a small, uncertain gesture in the air. Then, with terrible slowness, he pitched forward over the worn altar rail, striking it with a dull force that sent a prayer cushion skidding sideways onto the stone. One candle guttered violently. A sharp gasp cut the hush like a blade. Before anyone could properly move, Arthur Trallion lay face down upon the cold flagstones. He did not stir. At the corner of his mouth a bead of red appeared, tiny, bright, and horribly definite. It ran downward into the linen of his collar like sealing wax melting in heat. After that, order collapsed all at once. Mrs. Hartnell screamed. Young George Pratt dropped his hymn book with a crack that sounded indecently loud in the sacred stillness. Someone began whispering, then another, and then the whole church seemed to fill with that frantic undercurrent of frightened voices that spreads faster than fire in dry grass. People surged forward and then drew back. One or two women began to cry. Miss Marple did not rise immediately. She remained seated for the briefest moment, her hands folded, her pale eyes moving from face to face with extraordinary alertness. It was a habit of long standing. The first seconds after catastrophe are often the most illuminating. People who have had time to arrange their expressions may deceive. People taken by surprise rarely do. She saw genuine horror in Mrs. Bantry, irritation in Colonel Easterbrook, quickly replaced by alarm. The vicar's wife looked not only shocked but almost angry, as if events had somehow behaved improperly. The vicar himself had gone white to the lips, and Mr. Peveril, the solicitor, had instinctively put a hand inside his coat. That, too, was worth remembering. By the time the first rush reached the altar rail, Miss Marple was already moving quietly down the aisle. There was nothing hurried in her manner. She slipped through the confusion like a thread passing neatly through cloth, and touched Reverend Lenwich lightly upon the sleeve. He started as though struck. His face was damp despite the cold. His lips moved soundlessly, as if he were still trying to continue the service by force of habit. Yet his eyes slid almost at once, not to the body, but toward the vestry door. That was interesting. Arthur Trallion had been well liked, prosperous, and considered generous to both church and village. He had only returned from London 3 days earlier, laden with parcels for widows and pensioners, and accompanied, so village talk said, by news of an important advancement in his firm. There was no obvious enemy, no visible quarrel, no public disgrace, and yet there he lay now, beneath the stained glass nativity, the painted Christ-child above him washed in scarlet and gold light like an irony too grotesque for words. Dr. Haydock arrived at last, elbowing with unusual firmness through the cluster of parishioners. One glance at his face was enough to silence several people. He bent over the fallen man, felt for the pulse, drew back an eyelid, and then, after the slightest hesitation, lowered his face near the mouth. Miss Marple, standing a pace behind, asked in her gentle voice whether poison seemed probable. Doctor. Haydock gave her one brief sharp look. He did not answer, but he shook his head once, grimly, not in negation, but in acknowledgement of something unpleasantly likely, and reached for a folded altar cloth. Outside the west porch the wind had risen, and snow was drifting inward in small ghostly swirls. As Miss Marple glanced toward the doorway, she caught sight of a shadow passing swiftly beyond it. Small, light-footed, a boy perhaps, a chorister. The impression vanished before she could be certain, but certainty was not always necessary at the beginning. Noticing came first. Certainty came later, if one was patient. Reverend Lenwich found enough control to murmur that perhaps they should pray. The congregation obeyed, though clumsily and with very little of prayerful composure about them. They knelt because they did not know what else to do. Miss Marple did not kneel. Her eyes were on the chalice, still resting where it had been set down. A thin line ran along its stem, catching the candlelight. Wine? Condensation? Something brushed there by a hand? The vicar reached toward it, then seemed to think better of the gesture. His hand hovered a second too long in the air before drawing back. Again, a detail to be preserved. Constable Reed entered at last in a state of considerable agitation, helmet askew and face reddened by cold and sudden responsibility. He looked round helplessly until Miss Marple, with a calm practicality that often rescued weaker men from confusion, yet suggested in a low tone that no one should touch the body until Inspector Crackenthorpe, known in the village simply as Inspector Craddock by unfortunate abbreviation and older habit, could be sent for, and that those nearest the altar at the time ought to remain within the church. Reed seized upon the advice gratefully and repeated it in a louder voice, as though it had been his own thought from the first. The bell in the tower gave one accidental and hollow note overhead, as if the very building had shuddered. Snow thickened outside. Within, fear deepened and took on shape. Mrs. Trallion had to be supported to a pew after nearly fainting outright. Mr. Peveril, again observed by Miss Marple from the corner of her eye, appeared to slide a small object deeper into his inner pocket. The sexton lingered near one of the pillars, rubbing his wrist with a curious and repetitive motion. Mrs. Sims, the widow from the cottages beyond the green, moved past the offering plate with a face so smooth and unreadable that Miss Marple immediately distrusted her composure. Dr. Haydock rose at length. "Poison," he murmured quietly to Miss Marple when he could do so unheard by the others. "Almost certainly. Digitalis, perhaps. Cyanide, perhaps. There's a bitterness, though I won't be certain till morning." Miss Marple inclined her head. Her mind went at once to the order of events. Mr. Trallion had approached the rail. The wine had been poured. The chalice had rested briefly unattended. The acolyte had waited. The vicar had lifted it. But the rim, the rim, the victim had touched that directly. Third, if something had been applied there after the pouring and before the drinking, the field of opportunity was suddenly wider than most people would imagine. Then came the second disturbance. One of the smallest choir boys, Simon Guthrie, could not be found. At first the absence was noted only by another chorister, who glanced about impatiently for his companion. Then someone discovered the child's robe crumpled behind a pew. A little wave of alarm passed through the church, separate from but feeding the larger terror. A dead man at the altar was shocking enough. A missing child, following instantly upon it, pushed the whole business into another realm altogether. Miss Marple closed her eyes for the briefest second. The shadow at the west door, the vanished Thomas Finch earlier in the night. Now Simon Guthrie gone as well. The church had begun the evening full of worshippers. It was rapidly becoming a place of absences. When Inspector Craddock at last arrived, stamping snow from his boots, and carrying with him the dry competence of a man used to ugly interruptions, he found Miss Marple back in the same pew from which she had observed the service. She looked exactly as she always did, harmless, composed, elderly, mildly attentive. He knew better. She greeted him with a slight nod and said only, "Someone did not come to worship tonight, Inspector. Someone came prepared." He held her gaze a moment and gave the smallest return nod. He too had learned better than to dismiss her remarks as the village embroidery. The church was sealed as far as circumstances allowed. Names were taken, positions established. Reed was sent to note the tracks outside before further snow spoiled them. Questions began. The ordinary sacred stillness of the building had altered completely. It had become, in the space of a quarter hour, a chamber of suspicion. Later, walking back to her cottage through thickening flakes, Miss Marple kept her lantern low and her thoughts very active indeed. Arthur Trallion's affairs passed through her mind one by one. His reported promotion, his investments, his widely praised generosity, his daughter's engagement to a young officer home for Christmas, the old rumours, too, of money lost and recovered, of a debt paid with remarkable haste, of some anxiety he had concealed rather too energetically behind good works and Christmas parcels. And there had been that letter. She had seen him post one the day before, brown envelope, and pressed carefully into the postbox with a curious deliberation, almost tenderness. Men do not post ordinary business letters with tenderness. At her gate she stopped and looked back toward the dim halo of the church tower through the snow. Motive, she thought, would be there. It always was. Whether the engine was greed, fear, jealousy, or revenge, one eventually came to the same thing: human weakness arranging itself into action. Inside her parlour she lit the fire higher, set milk to warm, and made herself a cup of cocoa. As the flames brightened the room in orange and gold, The scenes of the night arranged themselves more sharply in memory. The vicar's face, too pale. The bitter trace in the wine when she had later, under pretext of assisting, touched a droplet to her tongue. Far more bitter than altar wine should be. The swift shadow at the west door. Somewhere she was increasingly sure a frightened child knew more than any adult presently inside the church. Inspector Craddock returned before dawn for preliminary statements. Mrs. Sims was questioned in the vestry. Her account shifted under pressure. First she'd been near the nativity display. No. Near the font. No. She had paused at the side aisle to retrieve a glove. These movements, individually harmless, collectively formed a pattern of evasion. Miss Marple, waiting in the nave, listened to the rise and fall of voices through the half-open door. Then Mr. Greaves, the chemist, arrived of his own accord. He was heavily bundled, his cheeks bright from the cold, and he explained rather too readily that word of the tragedy had reached him from a late customer, and that he had come merely to offer assistance. Yet when Miss Marple's eyes dropped to his boots, she observed something curious. They carried no true trace of the snowy lane, no whitening at the sole, no damp clinging in the treads, no signs of a walk recently taken from the chemist's shop to the church. They looked, in fact, as though they had been carefully cleaned or scarcely used at all. Mr. Greaves met her gaze and looked away at once. Outside, search parties moved through the churchyard with lanterns, their lights swinging over headstones and yew trunks, throwing long black bars across the snow. They were looking for Simon Guthrie. No sign of him appeared. Within, Dr. Haydock supervised the preparation of the body for removal. In lifting the fallen altar cushion, he discovered a small scrap of paper tucked partly underneath the rail. It had clearly not lain there by accident. Inspector Craddock unfolded it. The message had been clipped from newsprint. "Justice is mine, saith the Lord." He showed it to Miss Marple. She studied the type without touching it. Newspaper print, not church paper. Deliberate, theatrical, moralizing. Such gestures are often intended less to reveal guilt than to direct suspicion. A person truly righteous rarely feels compelled to advertise it in pasted quotations. "People will suspect the stranger," Craddock murmured. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "which is exactly why one must be careful." At around 3 o'clock the snow ceased at last and stars broke through above the church tower with a cold, merciless brilliance. Miss Marple stepped outside beside the inspector and looked over the disturbed white ground. Many footprints crossed and recrossed the yard now, but among them she picked out a smaller set leading away through the lich gate toward the meadow path. They were light, almost hesitant, the steps of a child or very slight adult. At a point near the frozen brook the trail became confused. Snow had been deliberately brushed or kicked over part of the surface. The ice itself remained unbroken. "A crossing point, perhaps," said the inspector. "Or a meeting place," said Miss Marple. He ordered dogs sent for at first light. Back in her cottage once more, she made tea this time rather than cocoa and sat for a while without drinking it. Her hands wrapped around the warm cup as her thoughts continued their quiet work. The newspaper clipping interested her. So did the London envelope she remembered Trallion posting. The Gazette had come to the village recently in a brown wrapper. Yes, she recalled that now. The postmistress had remarked upon it. She looked at the clock. 4:30. Taking up her crochet, she let her fingers move while her mind ranged freely. Murder, she reflected, is rather like tangled wool. Tug at it blindly and the knots draw tighter. Find the right strand, and the whole confused business begins to yield. The chalice, the rim, the bitter trace, the vicar's hesitation, Mr. Peveril hiding something, the chemist with clean boots, Mrs. Sims contradicting herself, a missing choirboy, a second boy already frightened before the death occurred. Too many irregularities for coincidence. At last she set down the crochet and opened a small notebook. On the first page she wrote 3 questions in her neat hand. Who profited from Arthur Trallion's death? Who feared Arthur Trallion alive? Who had access to the chalice after the wine was poured? She looked at the words for a moment. Answers she knew were already moving toward her. By morning the village would be awake, and with wakefulness would come gossip, speculation, recollection, and those loose tongues by which Providence so often assists justice. Someone would speak too quickly, someone would remember too late, someone would lie in precisely the wrong way. Birdsong, faint and uncertain, began at last in the hedges outside. "Time does march," Miss Marple murmured. She closed the notebook, banked the fire, and rose. Somewhere in the village a boy was hiding. A chemist had not told the truth. A widow's story shifted like snow on a roof. A clergyman trembled, and at the centre of it all lay a silver chalice, a scrap of scripture, and a body collapsed before the altar on Christmas Eve. Miss Marple, outwardly no more than a gentle old lady with excellent manners and a talent for woolwork, prepared herself with quiet certainty for daylight. Christmas morning would dawn upon sorrow, but, she thought, perhaps not upon mystery for very much longer. Chapter 3. A Sacred Night. A Wicked Crime. The first harsh peal of the bell, marking the shattered conclusion of the midnight service, still seemed to tremble in the rafters when panic broke loose among the pews. Women clutched their hymnals to their chests as though paper and leather might ward off sudden death. Men leaned over the rails, calling in agitated tones for air, for water, for the doctor, for someone to do something. Children stared with round, frightened eyes at the still figure lying near the chancel steps, too young to understand the full nature of what they had seen, and yet old enough to feel that some dreadful boundary had been crossed. Snow whispered against the stained glass panes, muted by the old lead cames, while inside the church terror multiplied itself in every cough, whisper, and stifled cry. Mr. Trallion lay unnaturally straight, his arms fallen awkwardly apart, the white altar linen dragged partly beneath his shoulders in the confusion. The candlelight, which moments before had seemed soft and reverent, now touched his features with a merciless clarity. His complexion had taken on a waxen pallor, and there was upon his forehead the faint sheen of perspiration that belongs less to peaceful death than to violent bodily distress. Miss Marple's knitting, abandoned in her reticule, remained forgotten. She had risen with the others, but unlike them she did not move aimlessly or speak at once. Her pale eyes never left the body. The vicar, his own face drained of colour, knelt beside Mr. Trallion and began murmuring a prayer in a voice so low and uneven that it sounded more like an appeal than a ritual. Dr. Haydock, summoned by one of the quicker-minded parishioners, pushed through the crowd with unusual briskness and dropped to one knee opposite the clergyman. His examination was rapid and efficient. He pressed 2 fingers against the inside of Trallion's wrist. He bent close to the lips. He lifted an eyelid, let it fall, and then drew back ever so slightly. The congregation needed no pronouncement. The faint movement of his head told them enough. Yet Miss Marple's attention had already fastened on particulars. There was, she thought, something curious in the coloration. The lips were pale, certainly, but the fingertips and the beds of the nails showed a strange bluish mottling, subtle but unmistakable. It was not the appearance she associated with a simple seizure of the heart, nor was the perspiration, nor that rigid and almost theatrical straightness of the body after the fall. The observation lodged itself in her mind alongside an old memory, some medical paper she had once glanced through, an article in the Lancet, perhaps, describing the effects of certain rare alkaloids derived from tropical plants. She did not build a theory, she merely kept the fact. Facts, Miss Marple knew, were vastly more useful than excitement. Near the vestry, the church wardens attempted to restore something resembling order. Mr. Purvis, whose voice at parish fetes could always be relied upon to dominate proceedings without the aid of any mechanism known to science, now addressed the shaken congregation in a tone barely above a whisper, urging everyone to go quietly home. Yet scarcely anyone moved. Shock had fused them together into one unsteady, murmuring body. At last, Reverend Lenwich rose and, with touching if somewhat desperate formality, pronounced the final blessing. His voice quavered like the last inch of a candle flame. He shut the prayer book with trembling hands, and Miss Marple was struck by the oddness of the gesture. "Say, It was as though the poor man believed that if he performed the proper ending, the dreadful interruption might somehow be folded away with the service itself. Police Sergeant Tomwell arrived a few moments later through the south porch, his boots muffled by the aisle runner. He carried a short notebook and a face trying very hard to look official. Statements were taken. The statements contradicted one another almost immediately. One witness insisted Mr. Trellian had spoken some final word, though no one could agree what it was. Another was adamant that he had sighed. A third declared there had been no sound at all. Miss Marple, who had no faith in memory once fear had got at it, paid less attention to the reported words than to the manner of those reporting them. Mrs. Bartlett, a cousin of Mr. Trellian's by one of those long and thinning connections village families preserve with such vigour, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that remained obstinately dry, while keeping one speculative eye upon the chalice. Young Anthony Perkins, the bell-ringer, stared fixedly at the floor, as if afraid that to meet anyone's gaze might place him in some undefined danger. None of these things amounted to proof of anything, but together they formed texture, and texture was often what allowed a pattern to emerge. Little by little the congregation began to drift out through the lich gate into the hard, glittering night. Miss Marple did not go with them. Instead, she lingered near the chancel and stooped presently to retrieve a small broken sprig of holly that had slipped from the altar arrangement. The berries had been crushed underfoot, and were staining the nearby stone with a red smear oddly suggestive of blood. Beside it lay a puddled thread of hardened wax. Candle wax, certainly, but why there? The nearest candelabrum stood too far away for such drippings to have fallen naturally. Miss Marple traced the path of the wax with her eyes. It led faintly across the stones toward a plain wooden prie-dieu positioned opposite Mr. Trellian's pew. Someone, then, had moved a candle, and moved it recently, for one small ridge of wax near the end of the trail remained soft enough to glisten. It was the sort of detail nearly everyone else would overlook, not because it was unimportant, but because it was not dramatic. That was often the way with useful clues. Dr. Haydock, straightening from the body, caught her eye and gave the slightest movement of his head. They withdrew together into the Lady Chapel, where several votive lights guttered in their iron stand, giving off a dim and melancholy glow. "Well?" he asked quietly. "Natural causes, Jane? At first glance one might accuse the heart, but I confess I'm not at all happy." "Nor am I," said Miss Marple. His lips were oddly pale, but the nails showed discoloration, and there was something else, something almost bruised in the extremities. Haydock regarded her sharply. "You noticed that? One notices odd things in village life." "There was an odour," he said after a moment. "Very faint. Not quite what I'd expect with cyanide, though a careless observer might say bitter almonds and be done with it. This was stranger. I shall insist upon a post-mortem." "Very wise," said Miss Marple. "And if I may offer a little village advice dressed up as common sense, please have Sergeant Tomwell seal the chalice, the pattern, and anything else upon the altar, before half the parish puts a finger on them. Also, someone ought to note the wax on the nave floor." A reluctant smile touched Dr. Haydock's face. "Would you care to join the yard officially?" "I think knitting needles remain more suitable to my appearance than truncheons," she said, "though appearances, of course, are often misleading." Outside, the cold had sharpened. The air snapped against the skin like thin glass. Lanterns hung along the lane, their lights swinging in the wind. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer and made a slow circuit of the churchyard, under the respectable pretext of looking for a muff supposedly left behind by a niece who did not in fact exist. What she was actually doing was reading the snow. Near the yews she found a set of impressions fresher than the rest. They were broader than a child's, and yet not so deeply pressed as a grown labourer's boot would have been. They ran toward the vestry door, and then away again in hurried confusion, crossing and recrossing themselves. Not panic exactly, evasion perhaps. Against the headstone of old Captain Gloucester a scrap of paper fluttered. Miss Marple stooped and picked it up. It bore a few bars of music in pencil, part of "O Come, All Ye Faithful," hastily scrawled and then smeared by damp fingers. A choir boy's rehearsal sheet, no doubt. Or perhaps something dropped during haste or fear. She folded it and slipped it into her reticule. Time would decide whether it was litter or evidence. At the gate she encountered Mrs. Brent, the butcher's wife, red-cheeked from cold and excitement. "Dreadful, Miss Marple, positively dreadful. My Harry says the poor gentleman never uttered a sound, just toppled all at once like a pine coming down." "Did he indeed?" said Miss Marple sympathetically. "And tell me, Mrs. Brent, did you happen to notice anyone in church whom you did not know?" Mrs. Brent's lips tightened in immediate enjoyment of the question. "Only that tall fellow in the back. Dark coat, scar along his jaw or temple. Something of that kind. I had to shift during the hymn because he stood far too close. Never seen him before in my life." Miss Marple thanked her and continued homeward, the snow crunching softly beneath her feet. A stranger at midnight mass was not in itself extraordinary. Christmas drew all kinds: travellers, penitents, sentimentalists, and those who wished merely to be among others for an hour. Yet if a man intended to pass unnoticed, a crowded village service on Christmas Eve offered excellent cover. At home she made cocoa and let it simmer until it thickened pleasingly, then carried it to the chair beside her lace-curtained window. Across the lane, Sergeant Tomwell's bicycle wheels hissed through the snow as he hurried off toward the constabulary to send a telegram to the proper authorities. On the mantelpiece the clock struck 2. Miss Marple drew toward her an old notebook labelled in her tidy hand, "Village Events, 1938 to present." She opened to a blank page and wrote, "Trallion collapse. Possible poison. Wax trail on nave floor. Stranger with scar. Choir music sheet under U." Then she left a space beneath for motive. Mr. Trallion had been respected, certainly. But respectability was very seldom armour enough. Property, money, obligations, disappointed expectations, old resentments, any one of these could sour under the surface into something more dangerous. There had also been, if she recalled correctly, a tiresome disagreement only weeks before regarding parish restoration funds, and a small discrepancy no one had ever adequately explained. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Haydock stood outside, breath smoking in the air. "Jane," he said at once, "I've secured the chalice, but the wine flagon is missing from the vestry." Miss Marple felt the cold travel straight through the warm room and settle somewhere behind her ribs. Missing? Gone. It was there before the service. Now it isn't. Then someone removed it deliberately, she said. If the poison had been introduced into the wine itself, the flagon might have contained the clearest residue. Without it, we have less. Haydock nodded grimly. And there's more. One of the choir boys, Peter Crombie, is nowhere to be found. His parents assumed he was still at church. "The prints by the U's," said Miss Marple slowly. "Not a man's, not quite a small child's. A boy running in fright, perhaps." She set down her cup and reached for her scarf. "Come, Doctor, we had better search again." The moon had climbed higher, washing the gravestones in cold silver. Together they circled the church once more, lantern light probing the darker corners. Near the vestry wall they noticed a patch of disturbed snow roughly kicked aside. Beneath it lay the iron grating of a narrow coal chute, half concealed and standing open by an inch. Miss Marple knelt and touched the edge lightly. It was cold, damp, and recently handled. She bent her head toward the opening. "Peter, my dear," she called softly, in the same tone she might have used to reassure a skittish child at a school fete. "It is only Miss Marple. No one is going to hurt you." For a moment there was nothing. Then from the darkness below came the smallest imaginable sob. Haydock raised the lantern. The beam reached down and found a pale face peering upward from behind a heap of old coal sacks. Peter Crombie crouched there in his choir robe, smudged black with dust, eyes wide with animal terror. "Come along," said Miss Marple gently. "That's right. Slowly now. You're safe." He emerged shivering from the chute, clutching something silver to his chest so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The missing flagon. Haydock let out a sharp breath. Miss Marple said very quietly, "You have been most brave, Peter." The boy's lips trembled. I saw him pour from it," he stammered. "I thought if I took it away he couldn't finish, couldn't do any more." Miss Marple exchanged a quick glance with the doctor. "Who, Peter?" she asked. The boy looked past them both toward the dark outline of the bell tower. "The man with the scar," he whispered. The night seemed to draw itself tighter around them. Evidence, opportunity, fear, all were beginning to move toward one another. Yet the picture was not complete. Why Arthur Trallion? What secret joined a stranger, a frightened choir boy, and one of the most established men in the parish? Miss Marple placed a steady hand upon Peter's shoulder. "You have done exactly right," she said. "Yes, tomorrow you shall tell us everything, and now you must come in out of the cold." She rose, lantern light pushing back the shadows only a little. Above them the stars burned with that hard, indifferent brilliance which belongs especially to winter nights. Midnight Mass had ended not in peace, but in dread. Christmas Day had not yet dawned, and already Miss Marple felt the investigation tightening around its unseen centre. The hunt for truth, she thought, had very properly begun. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Silent Concern. Midnight ought to have brought the vicar peace. Instead, Reverend Lenwich stood at the vestry door, wringing his cold hands within the folds of his cassock, looking like a man who had mislaid not merely composure but certainty itself. The lamp on the small desk behind him flickered whenever the wind found a weakness in the leaded window. Miss Marple, lingering by the font longer than anyone had invited her to do, observed the way his eyes moved again and again toward the nave, as though he half expected the shadows to rise up and denounce him. The congregation had at last dispersed into the bitter night. Candles guttered low in their sockets, leaving curled streams of wax on the stone. A faint scent of evergreen still hung in the church, but now it seemed melancholy rather than festive. Somewhere behind the choir screen lay the body of Arthur Trallion, attended by Dr. Haydock until the police arrangements could be completed. The silence after panic is often more oppressive than panic itself, and such a silence now filled St. Mary Mead Church from wall to wall. Miss Marple advanced with quiet, deliberate steps. Her boots made scarcely any sound on the worn flags. When she greeted the vicar, she did so in the gentlest possible tone and began, as was her custom when approaching distressed clergymen or nervous suspects, by speaking of ordinary things. She mentioned the cold, the crowded service, the unfortunate shock to so many elderly parishioners. While she spoke, she watched. The Reverend Lenwich answered politely enough. His lips shaped appropriate phrases, yet his eyes avoided hers, and with every passing second his shoulders seemed to draw tighter, like cords being wound. It was not merely grief, nor even simple fright. Something was preying upon him more personally than either. He led her into the vestry. The room smelled of candle grease, old wood, and sandalwood soap. Upon the desk stood the chalice not yet removed, a little dark wine still showing at the bottom. Miss Marple noticed at once that the vicar could not stop glancing at it. When she asked whether she might sit, he produced a wan smile and indicated a chair. Then he remained standing himself, as if rest would be an admission of weakness. Outside, the clock in the bell tower struck 1. At the first note the vicar flinched. He spoke then, first of sorrow, of course. Mr. Trallion's death, he said, was a blow to the whole parish, a tragedy beyond words, a grievous interruption of what ought to have been the holiest and most comforting service of the year. The phrases were proper enough, yet his voice broke upon them in a way that suggested not merely sorrow, but strain. Miss Marple praised his steadiness before the congregation. He bowed his head, but there was no trace of pride in the gesture. If anything, he looked pained by the compliment. After allowing the silence to settle, she asked whether there had been any difficulties of late between Mr. Trallion and others in the village. The vicar's fingers twitched visibly. He replied too quickly that Mr. Trallion had been esteemed by all. Even as he said it, Miss Marple's gaze had wandered, quite innocently, one might have thought, across the desk. There, partly obscured by a parish ledger, she noticed a dark, reddish smear. The vicar followed her glance and immediately placed a hand over it. "Candle wax," he murmured. "An unfortunate spill." "Of course," said Miss Marple mildly. The explanation did not satisfy her in the least. The substance was too dark, and the speed with which he covered it too instinctive. Beside it lay the ledger for the Christmas Charity Fund. Miss Marple recognised the book at once. The vicar saw that she had recognised it, and a bead of perspiration appeared near his temple, though the room itself was far from warm. She remembered suddenly how he had looked at the altar rail only moments before Trallian's collapse. The same strained mouth, the same rigidness in the hands. A pattern then, not an isolated tremor. A distant door slammed somewhere in the church. Footsteps approached along the nave. Inspector Craddock's silhouette darkened the doorway for an instant before he entered fully, bringing with him cold air, snow, and the solid, practical force of official inquiry. The vicar started like a hunted creature. Miss Marple laid one hand lightly on the desk and said, and in that quiet voice of hers which so often compelled the truth more effectively than accusation ever could, "It is a great pity, Reverend, but secrets in churches have a way of sounding louder than hymns." He closed his eyes for a moment. Then, all at once, his resistance seemed to fail. Earlier that afternoon, he confessed, a letter had arrived. It had been hand-delivered, left among the ordinary post. The writing was irregular and unsteady, the tone obscure but alarming. It warned that the purity of the midnight service would be broken. He had taken it for some malicious jest or the product of a disordered mind. He had not shown it to anyone because he had not wished to create alarm on Christmas Eve. Now, he said in a shaking voice, he feared it had foretold murder. Miss Marple asked to see the letter. He fetched it from a drawer, though his hand trembled so violently that the paper rattled. The ink had run in one corner, perhaps from damp, perhaps from nervous fingers. One line, written with peculiar emphasis, seemed to darken the room more than the winter night outside. "The chalice shall carry more than wine this night." Miss Marple read the words twice, and then laid the letter beside the chalice. So. The warning had been specific, not a vague threat, but one directed at the sacrament itself. That altered things considerably. Whoever wrote it had either planned the crime, known of the plan, or wished to direct suspicion toward one of those possibilities. And why send it to the vicar unless one wished either to taunt him or to ensure he became entangled in guilt through silence? Inspector Craddock stepped fully into the room and greeted Miss Marple with a curt nod. The Reverend attempted to speak, but his voice failed him. Miss Marple, with gentle efficiency, passed the letter to the inspector and explained its arrival, its concealment, and the event that had followed. Craddock read it once, his expression hardening. "And you did not inform the police?" he asked the vicar. Lenwich stammered an apology. He added with some difficulty that Mr. Trallian had recently donated a substantial sum toward the Restoration Fund, and that envy had been stirred in certain quarters of the parish. It was not, Miss Marple thought, an untrue answer, but it was not the whole answer either. Envy might be present, yet the way he said it suggested he was sheltering something else behind the statement, as a person shelters a broken object behind a curtain. The inspector turned to Miss Marple. She mentioned the visible tremor that had seized Mr. Trallian before he fell, the curious scent around the chalice, and the vicar's account of the warning. Craddock at once ordered the vessel and all associated items sealed for analysis. Constables moved in and out with sudden business-like energy, and the atmosphere of the vestry changed from private dread to official procedure. Through it all, Miss Marple continued to study Reverend Lenwich. His fear was no longer that of a man merely distressed by death in his church. It had deepened into something knottier, conscience perhaps, or dread of revelation. He looked like a man who had made one bad decision in the hope of avoiding scandal, and now saw that it might ruin him. The outer door groaned as the wind pressed against it. Snow drifted through the porch in pale flakes. Craddock requested a list of those who had received communion, and the vicar, going to the register, fumbled it so badly that he nearly upset the inkwell. Miss Marple offered a small, encouraging smile, but privately her suspicion sharpened. Once the necessary formalities had been completed, the inspector withdrew to continue his work elsewhere in the church. The vicar sank at last into a chair. "I should never have hidden it," he whispered. I knew I ought not to have hidden it." "No," said Miss Marple kindly, "you ought not. But one can still be useful after making a mistake, and usefulness is far more practical than remorse." He looked at her as though she had offered absolution without presuming to do so. At the doorway she paused and glanced back. The chalice had been removed now, and yet its presence seemed still to haunt the room like the after-image of lightning. Reverend Lenwich sat bowed beneath the wavering lamp, a lonely figure trapped between duty and fear. Miss Marple understood very well that the church that night had become a stage for several different dramas, all crossing one another in dangerous ways. The vicar's hidden letter was only one thread, but it was a thread worth following. Outside, she drew her shawl close. Across the green the cottages glowed softly, their window panes flushed with firelight. Near the lich gate a police lantern bobbed among the gravestones. Miss Marple inhaled the clean, severe air, and turned not toward home immediately but toward the rectory. There were household servants to be spoken with, deliveries to be accounted for, and the post itself to be traced. A housekeeper often notices what a clergyman overlooks. Behind her, the bells gave a low and troubled note. Fresh snow had begun falling again, descending so quietly that it seemed intent on erasing every trace of what had passed. Yet snow, Miss Marple knew, is deceptive. It covers. It does not destroy. The ground remembers, and so do people, though often against their will. As she walked, she pictured the vicar earlier that evening, lighting the altar candles with that letter already in his pocket. Had he hoped it was foolishness? Had he prayed the threat meant nothing? And then there was the ledger. Money, Miss Marple reflected, had a way of introducing strain into even the gentlest parishes. If some irregularity in the Restoration Fund had come to Mr. Trallian's attention, there might indeed have been confrontation. A desperate man might conceal a letter for fear of scandal, but poison suggested forethought. It did not belong naturally to panic. And the note itself hinted at malice older and colder than any quarrel of the afternoon. She paused for a moment and looked back toward the yew trees black against the snow-bright sky. Somewhere among those shadows, she thought, a murderer had waited for the Sanctus bell. She meant to follow that echo all the way to its source, for evil seldom arrives all at once. More often it gathers quietly, like mist over a field, and only those with patience enough to look closely perceive its outline before dawn. Chapter 5. The Missing Choirboy. Dawn came reluctantly to St. Mary Mead. A pale winter light stretched thin fingers across the rooftops, turning chimney pots silver and faintly rose-coloured against the cold sky. Beyond the village green, the frozen pond lay hard and dull beneath its coat of frost, and from somewhere near its edge came the distant chime of loosened ice. Children had meant to skate there on Christmas afternoon. No one spoke of skating now. Arthur Trallian's death had fallen across the village like a black cloth over a mirror. Every cheerful arrangement had gone flat beneath it. Even the sparrows hopping along the snow-dusted churchyard wall seemed to make less noise than usual, as if instinct had warned them that something unnatural had entered the day. Inside the vicarage kitchen, Miss Marple sat warming her hands around a cup of tea, while Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, moved restlessly between range and dresser, with the unfocused fussiness of a woman whose nerves had been overtaxed. The kettle hissed. A clock ticked with lonely insistence. The room smelled of coal, boiled milk and wet wool. Miss Marple had not slept much. The vicar's hidden letter had occupied her mind for half the night, as had the missing flagon, the frightened choir boy, and the uneasy certainty that the crime in the church was not complete. Dawn had confirmed that suspicion. Young Thomas Perry, the smallest and by all accounts the brightest of the choir boys, had not returned home. His mother had spent the dark hours pacing her parlour with a lamp burning in the window, a pitiful beacon for a child who never appeared. By 7 o'clock, Inspector Craddock had arrived at the vicarage, he stamping snow from his boots and carrying with him the first reports from the night watch. No one matching Thomas's description had been seen in the streets. The constable stationed near the lich gate swore that only adults had left the church after the confusion. Mrs. Aldridge poured weak coffee for the inspector. He drank it without noticing the taste. For a few moments the three of them sat in silence, broken only by the rattle of the spoon in the cup and the breathy sigh of the kettle lid. Then Craddock frowned and asked whether the child might simply have wandered into the rectory, fallen asleep in some spare room, or hidden himself in fright until morning. Mrs. Aldridge shook her head with a firmness that bordered on indignation. "I checked every bed at 6, not one disturbed. The house feels empty, Inspector." Empty and wrong. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Then," she said, drawing her shawl more closely round her shoulders, "we'd better begin where frightened children so often return, at the place where they were last afraid." Craddock understood her immediately. Together they crossed the frozen green to the church. The great oak door opened with a groan, and they stepped into air so cold and still, it seemed the building itself were holding its breath. The nave lay empty beneath shafts of winter light that spilled through the clerestory windows and fell across the aisle in pale bars like prison shadows. The church no longer looked festive, it looked exposed. Miss Marple moved first to the font, then let her eyes travel toward the darker recesses where memorial tablets leaned against ancient stone, and carved angels peered down with damaged faces. She called Thomas's name softly once. No answer came but the faint drip of melted snow from some hidden point in the roof. They searched the vestry, the robing room, the side chapel. Then at last they climbed the narrow stair to the organ loft. There the air smelled of beeswax, dust and old wood. Beneath the keyboard Miss Marple found what she had half expected and wholly dreaded: Thomas Perry's surplice, cast aside in haste, one edge of the collar torn. Near it stood a pair of small black shoes tucked almost neatly beneath a hanging cassock, as if some childish instinct for order had persisted even through fear. Inspector Craddock straightened slowly. "He took them off," he said. "To move silently?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "or because someone told him to." She knelt and ran one finger lightly over the boards. There were faint scuff marks in the waxed surface, swift movement, perhaps a struggle, perhaps only panic. Beside the balustrade lay a crushed candle end with its wick blackened down to the wax. Someone had brought a light to the loft after the organist had gone. Such a thing did not happen by accident. As they came down again, they heard the vicar calling from below. Reverend Lenwich stood near the chancel arch, paler than ever, clutching a freshly unfolded newspaper in both hands. The headline, set in ugly, cheerful boldness, announced the death at the altar. The smaller line beneath it mentioned the missing choirboy. Miss Marple saw at once that notoriety frightened the poor man almost as much as the murder itself. Public scandal, to some temperaments, carries all the horror of fire. When she asked whether he recalled seeing Thomas after the service ended, he shook his head miserably. "In truth," he said, "I remember very little after the collapse. Everything blurred. There was the letter, and then Mr. Trallion—" He stopped, pressing one hand to his forehead. "It is as though I have been trying to think through smoke." Outside the north porch, Constable Barnes approached with reddened cheeks and a look of grim importance. He had found tracks, he said, small impressions leading from the side door to the hedge behind the church hall. The tread was indistinct, smoothed by snow, but they seemed likely to have been made by stockinged feet rather than shoes. At the point where the hedge opened toward the lane, deeper impressions appeared, those of a larger boot stepping across or beside the smaller trail. Fresh snowfall before dawn had softened much of the detail, but the suggestion was plain enough. Thomas had not simply wandered away. Craddock ordered a search at once. Villagers gathered quickly at the edge of the green with lanterns and mufflers, all Christmas morning domesticity forgotten in the urgency of alarm. Their breath steamed. Their boots crunched. Some faces showed honest distress. Others, Miss Marple thought, showed that species of excitement which tragedy unfortunately stimulates in communities, deprived of broader entertainment. She stood slightly apart, watching not the lane or the hedge, but the faces. Fear is universal. Its expressions are not. Mothers cried openly. Fathers muttered dark things about kidnappers and tramps. Yet one face in particular kept turning away whenever Thomas's name was spoken. It belonged to Mrs. Iris Vane, a young widow who had sat 3 pews behind Miss Marple during the midnight service. Her muff was crushed almost flat under the pressure of her gloved fingers. Miss Marple approached her gently, speaking first of the cold and the shock of the morning. When she asked whether Mrs. Vane had slept at all, the answer came after a pause too long to be natural. "Not at all," Iris said. Her eyes flickered toward the choir loft window and away again. "Interesting." As the searchers moved toward the river path, Miss Marple allowed herself to lag beside the widow. She spoke of Thomas kindly, his sweet voice, his quickness, the little errands he did for elderly neighbours. The absurd way even Colonel Easterbrook, who distrusted music on principle, had once praised the boy's singing. Tears sprang at once to Iris Vane's eyes. Then, as if the praise had loosened something inside her, she confessed that Thomas had called at her cottage 3 days earlier, with a Christmas wreath paid for by Mr. Trallion. He had stayed a little while for cocoa, and had asked curious questions about the military medals that had belonged to her late husband. That caught Miss Marple's attention at once. Medals in villages often carried more than memory. They carried stories of bravery, disgrace, promotion, injustice, and sometimes things better left unsaid. Miss Marple knew that Arthur Trallion and Captain Vane had once served in the same regiment. She also knew that many years ago there had been a murmur of a scandal, something military, something hushed, something most unfortunate, and then abruptly never mentioned again. Children ask questions adults have decided to bury. Could Thomas have overheard some fragment of truth? Had curiosity placed him in danger? They reached the riverbank, where thin ice gave little crackling protests beneath the boots of the search party. Men prodded the reeds with sticks while Inspector Craddock directed from the bridge. Then a shout went up from the sluice gate. Something white had caught there on the ironwork. For one hideous moment Miss Marple felt her heart contract. But when the cloth was brought up, it proved to be only a torn piece of surplice sleeve, stained with wax and dirt but not blood. The lock on the sluice remained closed. The dark water beneath held nothing but dead leaves and trapped reeds. Hope, though battered, survived. If Thomas was not in the river, he might still be alive. Miss Marple looked back toward the village. From Iris Vane's cottage chimney a steady thread of smoke rose into the brittle air. After a moment she excused herself from the search and made her way there. The door was opened by the maid, a frightened country girl who spoke in quick, uncertain bursts. In the passage Miss Marple caught the smell of furniture polish and sweet cocoa. On the parlour rug lay a small painted wooden soldier, face chipped, one arm broken off. She stooped to pick it up and set it gently on the table. Toys, she thought, do not wander far without assistance. Conversation with the maid yielded more than perhaps the girl realised. Thomas had returned to the cottage yesterday afternoon, she said, carrying a letter from Mr. Trallion for Mrs. Vane. The maid had not seen its contents, but she knew her mistress had burned it after reading and cried for nearly an hour afterward. So the connection between Trallion and the widow had not ended with wreaths and polite charity. Miss Marple's mind turned a little more sharply. From the cottage she went straight to the post office, where Miss Hart, the postmistress, was sorting the diminished Christmas mail with an expression of aggrieved civic duty. By means of apology, mild confusion, and a tone suggesting that she sought only to settle a harmless domestic uncertainty, Miss Marple asked whether Miss Hart recalled any recent letter addressed to Mrs. Vane in Mr. Trallion's hand. Memory resisted for a second, then surrendered. Yes, there had been one. 2 mornings before Christmas. A brownish envelope, no, cream perhaps, but sealed with blue wax, and yes, the Trallion crest had been impressed upon it. When Miss Marple returned to the churchyard, the searchers were coming back empty-handed. The afternoon had already begun to fail. Evening stole colour from the snow until only the lanterns seemed alive. Inspector Craddock assembled the villagers in the parish hall to report that no trace of Thomas Perry had yet been found. The faces turned bleak and strained beneath the yellow lamps. At that moment Miss Marple stepped forward and asked, in a voice so soft that everyone had to hush in order to hear it, whether anyone had seen the boy leave the choir loft. For several seconds no one answered. Then Iris Vane raised a shaking hand, and she said that during the confusion after Mr. Trallion's fall, she had looked up and seen Thomas descending the loft stair with a parcel tucked beneath his arm. He had looked frightened. She had started after him, intending to comfort him, but lost sight of him near the north door. Then she heard a short, muffled cry, like a bird caught suddenly, and after that, nothing. She had told no one because she'd hoped, so she said through tears, that the child would turn up safe and she would not have added to the horror unnecessarily. Miss Marple believed the guilt. Whether she believed the whole of the explanation was another matter. Craddock ordered the north porch searched again. Lantern light bobbed over old stone and worn boards. Near the inner frame, at about the height of a child's hand, they found scratches in the paint. Lower down, whereas caught against a splinter in the threshold, was a knot of crimson thread. Miss Marple knew the colour instantly. It matched the braid edging the regimental standard displayed in Iris Vane's parlour among her late husband's effects. When the inspector turned back with the thread in his fingers, Iris swayed so violently that Miss Marple had to catch her by the arm. The widow protested at once that she had done Thomas no harm. Through sobs and broken starts, she confessed something else instead. Arthur Trallion had recently sent her proof that her husband had been innocent in an old military scandal. The papers would clear Captain Vane's name, but they would also expose fraudulent conduct by another officer, a man now respectably placed and closely tied by marriage to wealth in the village. Trallion, burdened by conscience or justice or both, had intended to place the documents into church-keeping after Christmas, where they could not be quietly buried again. That, Miss Marple thought, was the sort of truth men killed to prevent. When Iris could speak more calmly, Miss Marple asked one last question. Had Thomas still possessed the papers when she last saw him? The widow pressed a hand to her mouth. Then memory came back to her. She had given the boy her muff to conceal the envelope inside so that it would not be bent or snatched from him in the crush. The muff was dark fur lined in scarlet silk. At once Miss Marple turned toward the vicarage. There, on the hall table in the porch, lay just such a muff. Reverend Lenwich, when questioned, said hastily that he had found it abandoned in the pews and meant to return it. But in the agitation of the day he had never looked inside. That omission, Miss Marple thought, was either entirely natural or very much the reverse. With delicate fingers she reached into the lining. There was no packet of papers. Instead she drew out a small silver medal on a torn ribbon. The choir boy's award Thomas Perry had proudly worn at Whitsun and every special service since. For a moment no one spoke. The absence of the documents was bad enough, but the presence of the medal made the thing crueler. Someone had not only taken the papers from the child, they had stripped away the symbol of his pride, almost as if to make him smaller, weaker, easier to silence. Inspector Craddock's face hardened visibly. The case, which had begun with poison, had now widened into abduction and the reopening of an older buried wrong. Miss Marple stood with the little medal in her hand, feeling both its actual weight and the burden of what it implied. As the church bell struck 6 through the cold, darkening air, she made a silent promise. Thomas Perry would be found. Snow might conceal tracks. Fear might close mouths. Respectability might shelter wickedness for a time. But truth, she thought, is like the dawn over winter fields, delayed, obscured, and chilled, yet impossible to keep buried forever. Chapter 6. A Confession. Beneath the candlelight. Snow brushed softly against the mullioned windows of St. Mary Mead Church like fingers asking admittance. Midnight had passed into Christmas morning, and the village, exhausted by fear and gossip and interrupted worship, had withdrawn behind bolted doors and hurried fires. Yet the church itself was not entirely empty. A single lantern burned near the chancel steps, for its flame bending and recovering in the draught. The shadows it cast were tall and uncertain. Miss Marple returned there alone. Inspector Craddock's men had already searched the churchyard for signs of young Peter Halcombe, until even their professional patience had begun to freeze. They had gone promising to resume at first light, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that when terror clings to a place, answers often do likewise. They do not always run far. She crossed the nave with the silent purpose of a woman going to fetch something she had mislaid. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the old flags. Then, from near the Lady Chapel, she heard it. A muffled sob. A woman knelt there in the half-dark, one hand pressed against the pew as if for support. When Miss Marple drew closer, she recognised Mrs. Letitia Bancroft, a farmer's wife whose usual steadiness and practical good sense had made her one of the least likely people in the parish to be found weeping in a church after midnight. Now her shoulders shook visibly. Candlelight caught the wet tracks on her cheeks and glimmered on the rosary twisted tightly in her fingers. "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, halting a little distance away, "are you ill?" Mrs. Bancroft started violently and pulled her cloak close, but relief followed recognition. "I ought not to be here," she whispered. "Ned told me to come straight home, but I couldn't bear it. Not after what I saw." Miss Marple slipped into the neighbouring pew and waited. That was one of her great advantages. She understood that silence, when kindly offered, draws truth more reliably than interrogation. The little lantern flames stretched and flickered. A draught moaned somewhere near the rood screen like the ghost of a hymn. "At the moment Mr. Trallion went to the rail," Mrs. Bancroft said at last, "I had bowed my head, but something moved in the corner of my eye, near the organ stair. Someone was standing there, in shadow, but close enough to see the altar." "No chorister should have been there then," said Miss Marple. "No." Letitia's fingers tightened on the rosary beads until they clicked softly together. "That was what struck me. It was wrong at once." "Did you recognise the person?" Mrs. Bancroft hesitated, looking ashamed of her uncertainty. "I recognised the cloak," she said. "A black watered silk cloak with rabbit fur trimming. I mended the hem of it myself last Michaelmas for Mrs. Constance Trallion." Miss Marple inclined her head without speaking for a moment. So the widow's cloak had been seen. But garments travel more easily than reputations, and one should never assume the wearer. "You're not certain it was Mrs. Trallion herself?" "No. The figure seemed shorter, smaller somehow. A child, perhaps, or a slight young woman. But the cloak made the shoulders look broader, and the hood hid the face." Miss Marple's thoughts shifted at once. Peter Halcombe was small enough. So were certain women. And a borrowed cloak can be either disguise or trap. "Did you notice the hands?" she asked quietly. Letitia shivered. "Yes. Gloves. Pale gloves. Kid leather, I think. Ivory-coloured. Quite foolish for such weather." "Unless," said Miss Marple gently, "one had a reason for choosing them." She pictured pale gloves hiding stains. Wine, powder, oil, poison. Delicate gloves often suggest vanity. Sometimes they suggest calculation. Mrs. Bancroft reached into her sleeve and drew out a folded square of linen. "Afterward," she whispered, "I found this under the pew. I thought at first it was just a dropped handkerchief. Then I saw the mark." Miss Marple opened it carefully. There was a small rust-brown stain on one corner. In the opposite edge were embroidered the initials E.L. in tidy burgundy silk. Not Constance Trallion, not Peter Halcombe, and certainly not a mere household rag. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The initials might belong to Reverend Edmund Lenwich, the vicar's younger brother, recently arrived in the village under the respectable pretext of spending Christmas quietly in the country. He had struck Miss Marple from the first as restless, over-alert and faintly resentful in that particular way seen in younger sons, impecunious scholars, and men who believe life owes them better arrangements than it has thus far provided. Mrs. Bancroft twisted the handkerchief anxiously. "I didn't dare take it to the inspector, not at once. I was afraid suspicion might fall on the wrong person. Ned says I'm soft-hearted. Perhaps I am. But I thought, you would know what ought to be done." Miss Marple folded the linen with delicate care. "Truth," she said, "is never made safer by being hidden. But it can sometimes be made more useful by being considered properly first. You did quite right to bring it." Letitia exhaled in a shuddering little rush. "I told no one else. That is wise, for the moment. Villagers feed on rumour as hens do on scattered grain, and with much the same discrimination." The remark won the faintest shadow of a smile. Miss Marple asked one or two further questions. No, Mrs. Bancroft had not seen the face. Yes, the figure had been watching the chalice. No, she had not recognised the gloves. and yes, she was quite certain about the cloak. At last Miss Marple rose and guided the woman gently toward the porch. Outside, the first paling of dawn had begun to smudge the horizon. The graves in the churchyard stood in rows like patient witnesses. A constable touched his cap from the gate. Beyond him, the rectory windows still showed a thread of light. Reverend Lenwich, then, had not gone to bed. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, his fear did not concern only the hidden warning letter. A clergyman may endure scandal for himself more readily than disgrace for bloodkin. When Mrs. Bancroft had gone, Miss Marple turned back into the church. She crossed to the very place where the farmer's wife had knelt and let her fingertips rest against the cold stone for a moment. Then she looked toward the organ stair and allowed the scene to reconstruct itself in her mind. A cloaked figure in shadow, pale gloves, the chalice waiting on the rail, choir voices rising, a brief chance, perhaps no more than seconds to touch poison to the rim, Peter Halcombe, or some other frightened child, seeing more than was intended. Edmund Lenwich, scholar and younger brother, lately whispered to be troubled by debts in London. Need Constance Tralyon's cloak on shoulders that did not quite fit it. A stained handkerchief marked E.L. The pieces did not yet lock together, but they had begun to speak. The deeper question remained motive. Money was always a candidate, yet money alone rarely explained the moral heat of crimes wrapped in scripture, warning letters, and gestures of symbolic revenge. Shame, jealousy, buried guilt, old love, family disgrace, these often ran stronger beneath the surface than any bank account. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Tralyon, newly widowed and outwardly composed. She thought of the church restoration funds counted by Tralyon and the vicar. She thought of those awkward village whispers about missing sovereigns later put right without explanation. She thought of Edmund arriving just as murmurs of financial irregularity had begun. And then she rose and went to the vestry. A faint line of light showed beneath the door. She knocked. Reverend Lenwich opened it almost immediately. His spectacles flashed in the lamplight, and for one instant clear alarm crossed his face, before habit restored his clerical courtesy. "Miss Marple, I did not expect—" "No," she said mildly. "But then Christmas has shown itself rather uncooperative in many respects. I wonder if I might borrow the key to the organ loft. I seem to have mislaid a knitting bag during the disturbances." It was a harmless request, absurd enough to disarm him. He handed her the brass key with a trembling hand. As he did so, Miss Marple noticed a smudge on his cuff. Brownish red, not fresh, something between rust and dried blood. He saw her glance and turned the sleeve inward too quickly. "Thank you," she said. "And Reverend, rest when you can. Christmas sermons demand not merely a clear voice, but a tolerably clear conscience." He stared at her, uncertain whether he had been rebuked, forgiven, or warned. Miss Marple climbed the narrow stair behind the organ once more. The loft smelled of dry timber, dust, and long-trapped cold. Motes floated through the lantern beam like dull gold snow. Near the railing she found marks in the boards, fresh scratches, parallel, as though something moderately heavy had been dragged or shoved. Kneeling, she examined the floor more closely and noticed that one plank had shifted slightly. Beneath it protruded the edge of a folded scrap. She worked it free with careful fingers. It was parchment or thick writing paper, creased and thrust away in haste. The handwriting on it was uneven and agitated, very like that of the warning note shown to the vicar. The words, however, were more explicit and colder still. "The debt is paid in blood. Tomorrow the widow shall rejoice alone." Miss Marple read it twice. Someone then believed this murder to be settlement. Not random malice, not opportunism, but reckoning, at least in the mind of the writer. And the reference to the widow suggested either Constance Tralyon or another widow in the village whose past touched Arthur Tralyon's own. She folded the note slowly. Peter Halcombe's disappearance, the borrowed cloak, the stained handkerchief, the warning to the vicar, the hidden message under the loose board. Each clue widened the matter while somehow tightening its centre. This was not merely poison. It was accusation, memory, and revenge dressed up as judgment. Descending the stair, Miss Marple paused halfway and looked down into the dark body of the church. Christmas dawn was creeping towards St. Mary Mead. Soon doors would open, kettles would boil, rumours would bloom, and Inspector Craddock would begin asking harder questions. Before that happened, she must speak to Mrs. Trallion. She must also place the handkerchief and the parchment before the inspector, though not before she had decided in what order truth would best be told. Outside, the snow no longer looked white to her, not wholly. It seemed touched with the faintest shadow of crimson, as if the night had stained even innocence by association. Miss Marple drew her coat close and stepped into the morning. The next verse of the mystery had begun, and she intended to follow it to the final note, clear, human, and inescapable as a bell ringing over frozen fields. Chapter 7. The Widow and the Collection Plate. Dawn brought with it a frail and deceptive softness. A pale amber light slipped beneath low clouds and laid itself over the lanes of St. Mary Mead like silk spread over iron. The snow, touched by it, gleamed briefly as though innocence might still be possible in such a world. Yet no one in the village felt any warmth that morning. The church stood locked, a constable at the porch as motionless and black against the stone as a carved gargoyle. News of young Peter Halcombe's disappearance had frozen what little courage remained after Arthur Trallion's death. Even the bells, which should have proclaimed Christmas morning with cheerful certainty, seemed to wait. Miss Marple rose from the breakfast table in the old vicarage guest-house, where Mrs. Bartlett had attempted simultaneously to serve porridge, criticise the milk, and share the latest village intelligence in lowered tones. No crumb of gossip had ever been too small for Mrs. Bartlett's appetite, yet even she faltered now and then, as if instinct told her that St. Mary Mead stood on the edge of revelations too dark to be savoured in the ordinary way. Miss Marple adjusted her grey shawl, its wool faintly scented with lavender water, and went out into the lane. Frost crackled beneath her sensible boots. At the lich gate she exchanged a few words with the milkman, whose usual whistle had quite deserted him. He touched his cap and muttered that Christmas Day ought to ring with bells, not tragedy. "It will," said Miss Marple gently. "Once the bells have the truth to ring with." In the market square a small crowd had gathered around the police motor car. Inspector Craddock emerged from the station carrying a steel strongbox in both hands and passed without pausing, though he gave Miss Marple a brief nod of recognition. The box, she noticed, was treated with greater care than one gives to routine papers. Something confidential, something perhaps removed from the church safe or vestry desk, had plainly gone into official keeping. She watched him vanish into the station house and stored the fact away. Then her attention shifted. On the eastern side of the square, standing apart from the others, with the rigid stillness of a cut-out figure on a stage, was Mrs. Charity Blankenop. Widow Blankenop, as the parish thought of her, Susie had worn mourning so long and so faithfully that black seemed less a colour upon her than a condition of existence. Her dress was bombazine, her mantle velvet, her gloves dull and carefully mended. Only her eyes suggested unrest. They were an unsettled blue, moving too quickly from object to object and never resting for long. Miss Marple remembered, quite distinctly, that during the midnight service Mrs. Blankenop had slipped from her pew and lingered near the offertory dish. At the time the act had seemed no more than a village oddity, but afterward, when the collection was examined, certain banknotes had been found missing, only to be discovered again later in the vestry safe. The coins had remained almost untouched. The notes, however, had travelled. That was not the behaviour of simple theft. Miss Marple crossed the square and addressed the widow in her mildest voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Blankenop." The woman started violently. Her hand closed around a small velvet reticule adorned with tarnished jet beads. Miss Marple asked whether the cold agreed at all with her joints. It was the sort of question no one could object to, and almost no one answered honestly. Mrs. Blankenop gave a thin and unsteady smile. "I fear nothing agrees with them today." As she spoke, her fingers flexed against the reticule. Miss Marple noticed at once that the clasp did not sit entirely flush. Something inside prevented its proper closing. Mrs. Blankenop went on, in a voice made frail by more than cold. to say that the horror of seeing poor Mr. Trallion collapse had shaken her dreadfully. Miss Marple murmured suitable sympathy. Ears then turned the conversation so lightly that another person might not have recognised the turn at all toward the church collection. "A very distressing thing," she said, "when even an offertory dish appears to have had adventures of its own. One hardly expects offerings to wander." The widow stiffened. It was a minute reaction, but quite sufficient. "You think there was theft?" she asked. Miss Marple did not answer directly. "The inspector is troubled," she said instead. "He wonders whether the money may have been moved not merely as money, but as a kind of message." The words had the desired effect. Mrs. Blankenop's lips parted. Her eyes flew once toward the police station and then back again. When she finally spoke, the voice that emerged carried a low inner tremor. "Only a soul in great anguish would meddle with money dedicated to God." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple softly. "And did you observe such a soul near the plate?" For a moment it seemed the widow might retreat behind denial. Then something in Miss Marple's expression, perhaps its complete absence of prurient excitement, encouraged her otherwise. "It was I," she whispered. "I moved the notes. I did not steal them. I was looking for something." Miss Marple, without the slightest flicker of condemnation, suggested they sit down. They crossed to a stone bench beneath the yew hedge, where frost still silvered the seat. There, sheltered somewhat from the eyes of the square, Mrs. Blankenop told her story in fragments that gradually aligned. For months, she said, she had been saving half-crowns in memory of her late husband, who had loved the midnight service above all things. She meant to place them in a sealed envelope upon the plate as a tribute, but when the dish was first passed, the movement of the congregation and the hurry of the service unsettled her. Later, fearing her offering might be overlooked, she rose again during the litany and drew near the plate. There she had seen, beneath the covering napkin, a packet of banknotes bound together and labelled in Arthur Trallion's unmistakable hand. That, she said, had startled her. Miss Marple could imagine it. A private packet among public donations is always suspicious. Mrs. Blankenop explained that her husband had once done business with Mr. Trallion, and she recognised his writing at once from old ledgers and receipts. Curiosity overcame propriety. She lifted the packet only long enough to read the inscription. At that moment she heard someone approaching, panicked, and hid it in her reticule, intending to restore it before the service ended. Then Trallion fell. The church erupted. She fled. Outside, in shock and shame, she forgot the packet entirely until much later. At dawn, unable to bear the burden of it any longer, she slipped back and returned it to the vestry safe. Miss Marple asked very quietly whether the packet had contained only notes. The widow hesitated. Then she admitted there had also been a folded document sealed in red wax and bearing the crest of Trallion Hall. She had not broken the seal. This interested Miss Marple profoundly. So that was what might now rest in Inspector Craddock's steel box. She thanked Mrs. Blankenop for her candour, and said only that intentions, though they do not erase actions, are still important in the weighing of them. The widow's shoulders sagged, relieved by confession, but not yet eased of fear. At that exact moment a boy came tearing along the lane. It was George Liddon, the fishmonger's son, red-faced and breathless, shouting before he had even reached them that a constable had found signs by the old yew well. The well had been disused for years and locked for nearly 20. Miss Marple remembered at once the tracks she had noticed earlier in the snow. Her heart gave one quick, hard beat. She excused herself and followed the boy. A crowd had already formed around the well by the time she arrived. Snow had been trampled into grey slush by many boots. The ancient lid stood ajar upon its rusted hinges, and be forced wide enough for a narrow body. Inspector Craddock knelt beside it, face grim, directing 2 constables who were lowering a rope ladder into the shaft. A lantern swung below, painting the inner stones in weak yellow light. Then a shout rose from the darkness. What came up first was not a body, but a bundle wrapped in choir surplice fabric, and after that, a second shape. Peter Halcombe. He was cold, shaken and stiff with fear, but alive. His wrists had been bound only loosely, almost as though whoever tied him had done so reluctantly or in haste. When they drew him out and set him on the snow, his mother gave a cry so sharp and grateful that several villagers began weeping outright. Peter stumbled against her, clinging with blue lips and shaking hands. Miss Marple, standing a little back, watched the boy's face. He was frightened beyond his years, but not confused. That mattered. When Inspector Craddock questioned him gently, Peter managed to say that Mr. Trallion himself had asked him, after the service, to fetch a sealed envelope from the vestry. The errand, Trallion had said, would help the boy toward choir school, a dream Peter cherished with all the simplicity and force of youth. But when he took up the envelope, he had glimpsed a word written upon it. A tone. That word had frightened him. Before he could decide what to do, a cloaked figure had seized him and dragged him away. He had been hidden in the well, tied, and left with only a candle stub. At first, Peter said, he thought the person might be the vicar because of the cassock-like shape under the cloak. But then he noticed a scent. Jasmine soap, strong and sweet. The vicar, he was sure, never smelled of jasmine. Miss Marple stored that at once. Scent is one of the most treacherous and reliable of clues. People forget it. Their victims do not. When Peter and his mother were taken away to the doctor's surgery, Miss Marple withdrew from the crowd and began thinking with greater speed. Why would Arthur Trallion entrust such a task to a choir boy? Why label a packet a tone unless it contained either confession or restitution? Why hide the child rather than kill him? That suggested either haste, mercy, or divided intention. And Jasmine, yes, Jasmine belonged to another world, another generation, another set of habits altogether. She returned to Mrs. Blankenop, who had not moved far from the path. Now the widow's reticule lay flat against her skirt. As Miss Marple stood near her, she caught the faint perfume rising from the velvet, not from the fabric itself, but from the gloves that had held it. A sweet floral trace, out of place in winter, jasmine. Mrs. Blankenop saw at once that Miss Marple had noticed. Jasmine is charming in summer, Miss Marple said quietly, but rather memorable in a locked well on Christmas morning. The widow's face went white. Miss Marple did not press harder then and there. Instead, she suggested, in the tone one uses when proposing tea to a nervous invalid, that Mrs. Blankenop accompany her to the rectory parlour. Privacy, she said, often allowed truth to arrange itself more neatly before official ears were engaged. The widow nodded, tears rising. As the church bell struck 9, its iron note travelled over roofs and hedges and the white fields beyond, and with each chime the pattern seemed to grow clearer in Miss Marple's mind. Money moved from the offertory dish. A sealed document travelled in secret. A choir boy was hidden, but not murdered. Poison entered a chalice. All bore somehow the same signature, not handwriting but moral character. Guilt, fear, restitution attempted too late. At the church path, Mrs. Blankenop stopped and removed her gloves. The scent of jasmine lifted softly between them. "My husband," she said in a low, shaken voice, "will never rest unless I do what I must." Then, after a moment, "There are debts no banker can tally, Miss Marple. Debts of the soul." Miss Marple inclined her head. Before the day was done, she thought, the widow would speak again, this time not to a fellow parishioner, but to Inspector Craddock beneath the patient and accusing gaze of Saint. Mary Mead's saints in coloured glass. And when she did, the offering plate would prove to have carried more than coins. It had borne conscience, concealment, and the price of an older sin coming due. Snow began falling again as Miss Marple walked the widow across the green. The path ahead, she felt, might still twist, but not aimlessly. Justice was moving now with the certainty of a river beneath ice, hidden for a while, silent for a while, but gathering force all the same. Chapter 8. Tracks Across the Frost. Dawn broke over St. Mary Mead like brittle glass giving way beneath pressure. The shortest day of the year cast a pale and unwilling light across the churchyard, and every gravestone threw a long blue shadow over the crusted snow like ink strokes across white paper. Miss Marple stood by the lich gate with her breath making brief silver clouds in the air. A milk cart bell sounded somewhere far off, absurdly bright in the stillness. A dog barked once and then was silent, as though even animals recognised that the morning did not belong to ordinary noise. Constable Baker came striding along the flagged path in his greatcoat, his cheeks already roughened crimson by the cold. He touched his helmet in greeting. Miss Marple returned the gesture and bent immediately to inspect the snow at her feet. There they were. A line of small footprints led from the side passage of the nave toward the rear church boundary. The tread was fine and close, precisely the kind often seen on a child's better shoes, Sunday shoes, not everyday boots. She looked carefully at the spacing. The steps were hurried, but not yet wild. Why, a frightened child moving fast, not one already in full flight. "The boys?" asked Baker. "Very probably," said Miss Marple. The size and pattern matched Peter Halcombe. More importantly, the edges were sharp. Wind had not blurred them, nor had fresh snow settled into them. They had been made after midnight, but not long before dawn. The trail curved around the vestry buttress and went on toward the old stone well beneath the yews. Miss Marple moved first, tapping the frozen ground with her cane and holding up one gloved hand to prevent the constable from blundering over the prints. He obeyed, though with the strained impatience of a man who senses drama and would like to hurry to its conclusion. The yew branches, heavy with snow, drooped low over the well as though conspiring to hide it. The iron cover was still in place. At first glance, at least. Miss Marple brushed away the snow from the rusted lock and found what she expected to find. Deception rather than security. The padlock hung where it ought, but it had not been fastened. Someone had opened it, then returned it to its place, trusting appearances to do the rest. She lifted the lid. The hinges groaned like a reluctant witness. Beneath lay nothing but darkness, a circle of black so deep it seemed to swallow even the morning light. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, enough to let the weak dawn enter the shaft. The stone lining vanished downward in damp rings, and far below there was the faintest glimmer of water. Constable Baker gave a sharp intake of breath and pointed to the snow nearby. Half buried against the lip of the well lay a torn shred of red wool. Miss Marple stooped and picked it up with deliberate care. She recognised the colour at once. Mrs. Halcombe had knitted Peter a muffler of that exact cardinal shade, bright enough to spot among 20 choir boys in winter cassocks. Miss Marple had seen it many times, fluttering at his throat like a brave little banner. Now it was torn. She slipped the scrap into her reticule and looked again at the footprints. They approached the well, hesitated. There was a slight pivot in the snow, as if the child had faltered or turned, and then ended. There was no clean returning trail. Either the path away had been obliterated by weather, or Peter had not left in the ordinary way. Baker muttered that Inspector Craddock must be sent for at once. Miss Marple agreed, but first insisted the place be guarded. A careless crowd could ruin more in 2 minutes than the murderer had managed all night. When Baker mentioned that only the sexton and Reverend Lenwich held keys to the well, Miss Marple's thoughts turned immediately toward the sexton. She made for his cottage without waiting. It crouched behind a holly hedge, chimney smoking thinly. She knocked. No answer came. The latch, when tried, yielded at once. Inside the little house the kettle was singing on the range unattended. A pair of muddy boots stood by the mat. Their soles, she noticed instantly, bore a fine tread unlike the broad, blunt pattern one would expect from the sexton's usual work boots. That was odd. A trail of damp marks led through the kitchen and out toward the back. Miss Marple followed it to the shed, and there found Mr. Wilmot sprawled half across the threshold, a swelling bruise rising on his temple, and a broken lantern lying nearby amid shattered glass. He was alive. She fetched cold water, revived him as best she could, and, once he could speak, asked in the briefest and clearest way what had happened. His account came in broken whispers. Before dawn, someone had knocked and demanded the well key, claiming a lamb had fallen in. When he refused to surrender it without coming himself, he had been struck. He had not seen the attacker's face, only caught a glimpse of a grey scarf frayed at one end and a strong scent of peppermint. Peppermint! Miss Marple rose at once. That was no trivial detail. People often chew or carry peppermint to conceal another odour, spirits, illness, or nerves. By the time she returned toward the church, Inspector Craddock's motor had arrived. He stepped down into the snow with his coat whipping in the wind, and she gave him the facts in a crisp sequence that wasted no time. The small prints, the false lock, the torn muffler, the assaulted sexton, the stolen key, the grey scarf, the peppermint. Craddock sent men to protect Wilmot and called for a locksmith. While they waited, Miss Marple circled the yews and looked for what the first excitement had nearly obscured. There, half beneath a low branch, she found a larger footprint. The heel was worn and notched, as though a hobnail had once been there and worked loose. She had seen such a heel before, on the boot of Lionel Craxton, local handyman, sometime bell ringer, and man of a temper as poorly governed as his finances. The discovery pleased her less than it interested her. Lionel was the sort of obvious suspect who very often proved to have been useful, present, and compromised, but not central. The locksmith came. A pulley was rigged. A hooded lantern was lowered. It sank slowly through the shaft, painting the wet stones amber before dwindling to a bead of light. One constable descended first and shouted up that the water was deeper than they had expected for winter. Then, a moment later, came a second call, sharper with urgency. Something was floating below. They changed tools and lowered a hook. The first thing drawn up was not a body, but a soaked red muffler, the missing companion to the torn scrap Miss Marple had already found. It dripped black water onto the snow. The second recovery was more interesting still. A small leather satchel embossed with the initials CS. Inspector Craddock opened it carefully. Inside lay a number of folded letters, damp at the edges but still readable. The handwriting was Arthur Trallian's. Miss Marple stood beside the inspector and read enough to know at once that they mattered very much indeed. The letters were intimate without being romantic. They spoke of assistance, regret, gratitude for silence, and money paid so that a youthful indiscretion might not destroy the peace of a lady now widowed. The initials, taken with the satchel, pointed plainly enough to Caroline Sykes. Miss Marple's thoughts moved rapidly. Arthur Trallian had been corresponding privately with Mrs. Sykes. He had perhaps helped her financially, perhaps shielded her, perhaps participated in concealing an older scandal. If funds had passed through church channels or been masked as charitable contributions, then the vicar, or someone near him, might have discovered the irregularity. The satchel had then been hidden in the well. Peter Halcombe, seeing too much or carrying too much, had become a danger. Yet the well had not yielded Peter's body. Hope survived. Miss Marple said quietly that the small print suggested Peter may have come near the well, but not necessarily gone into it. If frightened, he might have been moved elsewhere, or escaped by another route entirely, perhaps by the ivy-clad rear wall. Craddock began giving orders at once. Men fanned out across the churchyard. Voices rose. Boots struck the frozen ground. The stillness of the place dissolved into purposeful movement. Miss Marple, however, returned not to the well but to the vestry. There she reopened the charity ledger. Pages near the back showed pressure marks, faint indentations where someone had written on a loose sheet placed above them. She fetched a bit of charcoal, the sort she kept for rubbings and household practicalities, and shaded the paper lightly. Words emerged in grey relief. "Forgive me, my dear, but I cannot keep your secret any longer. The parish deserves the truth. Meet me by the well after the midnight bell." The handwriting was Arthur Trallian's. Miss Marple sat back. So, there had been an arranged meeting. The well was not merely a hiding place discovered after the fact. It had been part of the design. The poison in the chalice, the satchel in the water, the missing boy, the envelope labelled a tone. The threads had drawn much closer together. Her gaze drifted to the chalice, sealed now in its evidence box on the desk. Poison at the altar. Letters in the well. A child who had seen what he ought never to have seen. A person moving between sanctuary and darkness, with sufficient confidence to exploit both. Still one note jarred. Peppermint. Lionel Craxton chewed pennyroyal lozenges, not peppermint. Miss Marple knew that because he had once offered her one in the churchyard, with such insistence that she had been forced to invent a medical objection. Someone else, then. Someone nearer the church, perhaps. Someone who needed to mask another scent or favoured peppermint habitually, and the grey scarf frayed at one end. She closed the ledger and went back outside just as snow began to fall again in a fine dry sweep. Already the footprints by the well were softening, the edges blurring, as the story in the frost beginning to erase itself. But Miss Marple didn't mind. She had read it in time. The bell marked the half-hour from above, solemn and clear. In its echo she heard, as vividly as if they were still before her, the hurry of small feet, the drag of a satchel, the whisper of a red muffler against stone, and the soft deceit of a lock left hanging open to look secure. Footprints vanish quickly in winter. Truth does not. It merely waits beneath the surface until warmth reaches it. Miss Marple turned her face toward the falling snow, and thought that before very long now, some long-buried thing would rise cleanly into the light. Cleanly perhaps, but not gently. And when it did, St. Mary Mead would discover that the frost had preserved more than it concealed. Chapter 9. Sin, Secrets and Redemption. Miss Marple sat at the small oak table in the vicarage study, while sleet rattled against the casement as though someone outside were throwing gravel in impatience. Reverend Lenwich, after a troubled consultation with Inspector Craddock, had given her leave to examine the parish registers and correspondence. The lamp burned low but steadily, spreading a buttery pool of light across vellum pages curled by centuries of damp and handling. Each time she turned a page there rose that unmistakable scent of old ink, dust and beeswax polish. The smell, Miss Marple always thought, of history trying not to be forgotten. She traced the neat columns with a gloved finger. Marriages, christenings, burials. Generation after generation entered in faded brown ink, as though the village itself had been stitched into paper like a sampler. Yet Miss Marple was not interested merely in names or dates. Facts, in their most obvious form, are often too proud to conceal anything. It is in the small omissions, the changes of pattern, the abrupt silences, that truth begins to show itself. There, in the older ledgers, she found Isaac Trellian. The grandfather of the dead man had returned from the Boer War with charm, appetite, and a reputation for taking risks that were forgiven rather too readily, because he carried them off well. In 1903, he had given a carved rood screen to the church. The entry was florid, self-satisfied, and publicly admired. Yet in the year following, the Trallian name vanished almost entirely from the donations list. Instead, another name began to appear, Mrs. Clarice Halcombe. Clarice, great-aunt to young Peter, had been a farmer's daughter from no great means. Her dairy had never prospered in a fashion that could explain the sudden generosity recorded beside her name. Lavish contributions, regular and curiously timed. Miss Marple sat back a little, the page still open beneath her hand. Outside, the church clock struck 3. The vicar's collie, asleep by the hearth, gave a twitch and resettled itself. Reverend Lenwich, exhausted into a troubled doze in the armchair, looked older even in sleep. Worry had carved furrows into his face that no rest could smooth away. Miss Marple turned from the register to a dusty correspondence file tied with faded ribbon. There were letters about lilies, pew repairs, roofing slates, and one fierce dispute over whether the harvest display should include turnips of an unsuitably comic size. Then, as dated August 1905, she found a letter that made her sit completely still. The handwriting matched the recent anonymous warning sent to the vicar. Its language was pious, injured, and venomous. It spoke of betrayal, of communion defiled not by poison, but by sin. It threatened exposure unless repentance were made and stolen funds restored. No names were written openly, but 2 initials appeared in the margin, T.H. Trallian and Halcombe. Miss Marple let the paper rest lightly in her fingers. She thought of Peter Halcombe's quick ears and quiet movements, of the places children hover in churches when they are supposed to be elsewhere. She thought of the old hush money implied by Clarice Halcombe's impossible donations. She thought of Arthur Trallian reopening accounts, financial, moral, and ancestral, that others had spent years trying to keep buried. If Peter had stumbled across one of these old letters, or guessed at what connected his family to the Trallians, he might have ventured where no child should have gone. And if someone else knew that he knew... Miss Marple extinguished the lampwick until only the hearth gave light. The room darkened. In that half-shadow, the shape of the thing grew clearer. The stolen money from the offering plate had not been stolen for greed. It had been touched, moved, and restored by someone struggling to balance an old account, not with the bank, but with conscience. Mr. Trallian's planned donation, his intention to put matters right openly, threatened to disturb that desperate balance. If old falsified figures were examined too closely, the past would rise. And someone, Miss Marple thought, had chosen murder rather than disgrace. Outside, an owl called from the yews. She slipped the old letter into her reticule, rose without waking the vicar, and went out into the sleet. Gas lamps hissed along the lane like servants whispering in a passage. She made her way to Primrose Cottage, where Diana Trallian, the widow, had withdrawn since her husband's death. A candle still burned upstairs. Miss Marple rang twice. After a delay, the door opened a few inches and Diana Trallian's face appeared, pale and strained in the dimness. Miss Marple asked whether she might come in for a moment, adding gently that it was in the Lord's service and, just as importantly, in service of the truth. The widow let her enter. In the parlour stood a Christmas tree not yet decorated. On its bare branches shivered in the draught from the window as though the room itself had forgotten how to celebrate. Miss Marple drew out the letter and placed it quietly before her. At the sight of the handwriting, Diana Trallian's composure gave way at once. She sank into a chair, one hand pressed over her mouth, tears brightening but not yet falling. "My husband found it," she whispered. "Not that one exactly. Others like it. Hidden with the old account books." She confessed then that Arthur Trallian, in preparing his grand Christmas gift to the church, had discovered irregularities in the parish accounts. At first he thought them recent clerical errors. Then he realised they stretched back further, into older ledgers and private transfers. The missing sums, he believed, had once been used as hush money when Isaac Trallian's affair with Clarice Halcombe came dangerously near exposure. The scandal had been covered, money had been moved, accounts had been altered, respectability had survived, but only by pushing the shame forward into another generation. Arthur, Diana said, had become convinced that unless the matter was confessed openly, the village would remain in bondage to it, silence breeding more silence, secrecy inviting corruption. She had begged him to leave it alone. He had answered that confession, however painful, was the only decent inheritance to give. Hours later, he was dead at the altar. Miss Marple asked whether he had shared his suspicions with anyone. Diana hesitated, then gave the name that completed another part of the pattern: Verity Lenwich, the vicar's late wife. Mead, during her final illness, had confided enough to Diana for the whole shape to become visible. Reverend Lenwich had not begun the matter, but years earlier, in panic and weakness, he had covered medical debts and older shortages by shifting parish money in ways he ought never to have done. Verity had known. She had begged Diana before her death to spare her husband public disgrace if any path short of scandal remained. Miss Marple listened without interruption. So that was the vicar's terror. Not guilt for murder, but guilt old enough to have become part of his bones. And someone else, loving him fiercely enough, had decided that exposure would be a cruelty worse than bloodshed. When she left Primrose Cottage, the sky in the east had begun to grey. Fresh footprints showed in the snow near the old well, though the place was supposed to be secured. Miss Marple changed course at once and followed them with quickened but steady steps. The constable posted nearby had blown his whistle and was struggling with the cover, now again forced half open. Miss Marple bent and peered into the darkness below. A small hand moved weakly toward the light. Peter Halcombe was alive. The boy was cold, bruised by terror rather than violence, and shaking so badly that his teeth chattered when they hauled him up. Miss Marple took his hand while the constables wrapped him in coats and blankets. He gasped that he had found an old letter hidden behind the altar, and that a hooded figure had caught him, pushed him, and left him there. Miss Marple told him softly that he had been very brave, and that secrets once dragged into daylight lose much of their power. Then she looked up. At the lich gate stood Reverend Lenwich, as white as paper. Beside him was his daughter, Clara. Her shawl had slipped from one shoulder. Her eyes were swollen and bright, with the look of someone who has gone beyond fear into inevitability. Miss Marple knew, before the girl spoke, that the last veil had lifted. Clara stepped forward. It was she said, who had poisoned the chalice. She had also pushed Peter into the well when he came upon what he should not have seen. She had done both not out of hatred for Arthur Trallion, nor malice toward the child, but because she could not bear to see her father dragged through scandal and ruin. Months earlier she had found one of the old letters in the parish archives and realised what danger its survival represented, when Peter discovered her hiding place. And when Trallion began asking questions that came too near the truth, panic took hold. Love, fear, and desperation had done the rest. Her words fell over the churchyard like frost, glittering, merciless, and cold. The vicar covered his face with both hands. Miss Marple felt no triumph. One never truly does at such moments, unless one is a very poor sort of creature indeed. There was only relief that the truth had emerged before another life had been taken to guard the first crime. She touched Clara's hand. "Confession," she said gently, "is a painful beginning, but it is still a beginning." The bell struck 6 as Clara was led away. Their solemn notes mingled with the harsh cry of waking rooks in the trees. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly in prayer. Sin had bred silence. Silence had bred fear. Fear had bred murder. But now, under the hard new light of Christmas morning, the whole sorry inheritance stood exposed at last. In the stillness after the bells, a robin began to sing from the churchyard wall, absurdly bright and brave. Miss Marple looked toward it and thought that grace, unlike scandal, has a way of returning even where folly has tried hardest to banish it. Chapter 10. Justice from the Pulpit. Wind moved over the slate roof of St. Mary Mead Church with a low, troubled sound, but inside the nave everything glowed. Candles burned in polished brass. Their light trembled in the glass of memorial tablets, in the silver of the altar vessels, and in the anxious eyes of those assembled once more in the place where devotion had turned, 2 nights earlier, to dread. At Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, and with Inspector Craddock's practical cooperation, everyone necessary had been summoned back. They sat now in the front pews, Reverend Lenwich, pale but composed by force of will, Mrs. Harriet Bellingham, her gloved hands folded too tightly, Mr. Giles Carter, churchwarden and natural mutterer, Dr. Haydock, young Peter Halcombe, wrapped in a constable's coat, and several villagers who had seen too much, guessed too much, or talked too much to be absent from the final unravelling. Miss Marple, slight in her neat grey coat, mounted the pulpit steps. The great eagle lectern gave her for the moment an almost judicial air, yet it was not the height that commanded silence. It was the calm with which she looked down at them all, as though she were about to begin not an accusation, but a lesson long overdue. When she spoke her tone was gentle, more suitable, one might have thought, and to a sewing circle than to the exposure of a murderer. Yet every word carried cleanly through the church. On Christmas Eve, she said, a holy service was interrupted by death. Mr. George Trallion fell at this very rail, and we have all mourned him. But grief, if it is to do any good, must walk beside truth. Her gaze moved to the chalice resting under glass upon the altar. The chemist has confirmed, she went on, that it contained digitalin, an extract of foxglove, deadly in very small quantity. That poison was introduced between the ringing of the Sanctus bell and the moment Mr. Trallion drank. A shiver of sound moved through the pews. Miss Marple turned toward the vicar. "Our reverend gentleman," she said, "could not have done it. After lifting the chalice, he did not relinquish it again before Mr. Trallion came forward. The opportunity belonged to someone very near him indeed. For a moment everyone looked toward the altar with renewed horror. Only the server was close enough, someone whispered. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "only Peter was close enough, which is why Peter was frightened." The boy shrank a little into the constable's coat. Miss Marple held up one hand. But fear is not guilt. Peter did not administer the poison. He merely saw more than was safe for him to see. She asked that he come forward. Peter obeyed, unwillingly but bravely, and stood below the pulpit with his eyes on the floorboards. Miss Marple spoke to him with the same soft steadiness she might have used over tea. "Tell them, my dear, what you told me by the well," he swallowed. "I saw a hand come round from behind the vicar," he whispered, "just for a second. It tipped something into the cup I wanted to say, but the hymn started, and then Mr. Trallion fell." "And whose hand was it?" The church held its breath. Peter turned slowly and looked down the pew. Mrs. Bellingham's. Every head swung toward the widow. She sat very still indeed, which is often the most incriminating thing a person can do. Inspector Craddock did not move. He had promised Miss Marple her full explanation, and he kept his promises when it mattered. "Let us put the matter in order," Miss Marple said. "First, the threatening letter sent to the vicar, warning that the chalice would carry more than wine. It was designed to unsettle, to suggest cowardice and foreknowledge, but not to identify the true murderer. Second, the missing coins and notes from the offering plate, which were later restored, an act meant to imitate petty dishonesty and scatter attention. Third, the footprints and hiding places, the old well, the torn papers, and the attempts to frighten Peter into silence. She drew from her handbag several sealed packets, the recovered bottle, the fragment of notepaper, and the other half of the vicar's warning. One person, she said, had reason to weave all these separate disturbances into one great confusion. Then she spoke plainly. "Mrs. Harriet Bellingham?" The widow's composure cracked at once. "This is fantasy," she said sharply. "You embroider. You always embroider." "No," said Miss Marple, and there was almost pity in her voice. "I mend. There is a difference," she went on. 20 years earlier, when Harriet had still been Harriet Fielding, she had entered service in Arthur Trallion's London house. A relationship had followed, imprudent, unequal, and eventually concealed. A child had been born. Peter. Arthur Trallion had supported them from a distance, but not openly. Respectability, ambition, then marriage had prevented that. Yet age, remorse, and the reopening of the old accounts had softened him. He had recently resolved to acknowledge Peter properly, to provide for him, and to make formal arrangements through his solicitor. He had also begun to set right other wrongs connected with the parish funds and the old scandal. Harriet, said Miss Marple, had feared that public acknowledgement less for herself than for the child. Scandal in a village spreads faster than influenza and lingers longer. Peter would be marked. Her late husband's respectable name would be dragged through gossip. Everything she had built from silence would collapse. "So you chose a different silence," Miss Marple said quietly. "A terrible one." The churchwarden muttered, "But the offering plate. She put the money back." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "because it was never about theft. She removed the notes to suggest disorder, confusion, perhaps childish mischief. Then she restored them, hoping suspicion would drift away from the altar and settle somewhere lower and more vulgar. She lifted the packet containing the torn paper. As for the letter, Mrs. Bellingham wrote part of it herself, imitating the old hand found in the archives, and kept the torn portion with the vial she later attempted to hide. She also sent Peter away in fear, telling him that because he had been near the chalice he might be blamed. Peter gave a small broken sound. "Mother said they'd think I did it." At that, Harriet Bellingham's strength seemed to go out of her all at once. Tears, long resisted, came to her eyes. "Everything I did," she said hoarsely, "I did for him." Miss Marple came down from the pulpit steps, not triumphantly, but as one approaching an invalid. "Love," she said, "is very powerful, Mrs. Bellingham, but when fear gets mixed with it, the result may be worse than hatred." Mr. Trallion's confession would not have destroyed Peter. Secrecy is what destroys. Children forced to live under shadow grow crooked, not because they are weak, but because truth has been withheld from them. Inspector Craddock rose then. He approached the widow with grave gentleness. "Mrs. Harriet Bellingham, I must ask you to come with me." She stood before he could reach her. "I will come." Then, to everyone's astonishment, she turned first not to the inspector, but to Peter. She touched his cheek with trembling fingers. "Forgive me." Peter, unable to bear the nearness of her grief, moved instinctively toward Miss Marple instead. The outer door opened. A gust of snow-laden air moved through the porch, making the candles flicker. Harriet Bellingham passed out between the constables, her dark figure momentarily stained crimson by the lamp behind the stained glass. Silence settled over the church once more. At last, Reverend Lenwich cleared his throat. "Miss Marple," he said, and though his voice was unsteady, it held dignity again. "You have preserved more than justice." She shook her head slightly. "No, Vicar. Christmas is sturdier than that. One merely has to clear away the cobwebs so it can be seen again." Then she turned to Peter. "You must come to tea tomorrow," she told him. "We shall discuss Latin declensions. An occupied mind, my dear, is one of the strongest defences against misery." For the first time in many hours, a hesitant smile touched the boy's face. Inspector Craddock lingered near the altar after the others began to stir. "There will be statements," he said. "Of course," said Miss Marple, drawing on her gloves. "But perhaps not this very minute. This evening belongs more properly to hymns than affidavits." He gave a faint smile. One does not often see justice delivered from the pulpit. "No," said Miss Marple, "but churches are after all intended for truth. It is pleasant when they occasionally remember it." When she stepped out into the night, the bells were sounding Compline. Snow had settled over the yews like new lace. Across the green, cottage windows glowed. Behind her, the scent of beeswax and myrrh still lingered in the church, delicate and persistent. Miss Marple drew her shawl close and turned toward home. Truth, she thought, had come into the open by a hard road. But then, so had many better things. The stable at Bethlehem had not been particularly comfortable either. And with that, in the clear cold after justice, she walked on through the snow while the bells rang over St. Mary Mead at last as they ought.